Thune, Senator Lankford, and Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. Madam Chairman, would you characterize the pandemic as being over?
Well, I think we're still living with COVID. Its impact on America has diminished, but it still certainly exists and is affecting the economy.
I think for all practical purposes, most people acknowledge, yes, there's some overhang, but that it is over. And so just out of curiosity, how much of your workforce is back in the office?
We're basically back to business as usual, although we have policies that enable a certain amount of work from home, as most companies and offices do. It's a practical and efficient way to conduct business these days.
There are some things that may be true, and this isn't directly your purview. Maybe it's a better question for the banking regulators. But I would be curious to know how much of their workforce is actually back in the office and functioning, because it seems to me that from a supervisory standpoint, if your job is to examine banks, that's something that you kind of have to be there to do. And it seems to me, at least, in your agency, as recently as when we were talking about the Inflation Reduction Act back in August, my understanding at that time was less than half back in the office. If that's up, I'd like to know what the updated number is on that. Let me ask you, will you commit to keeping this committee apprised of the Treasury's findings when it comes to SVBs, what you find there in a timely and thorough manner?
We certainly will keep this committee updated. However, much of the investigation of what happened at this bank would be done by the FDIC, and so that's an appropriate source of information.
And we'll make sure we ask them that same question. But I know that you'll be involved. I mean, this obviously is something that dramatically impacts the economy and would be something significantly of interest, I would think, to the Treasury Department. And I'm hopeful you'll stick to that commitment. In a previous Finance Committee hearing, you gave your, quote, absolute word to keep us updated on Treasury's findings about the private taxpayer data that was improperly shared from the IRS to ProPublica. It's been almost 2 years since that breach of taxpayer data was made public, and the administration still hasn't provided a meaningful response. And you can answer that, but let me move on here. I want to ask a question about the actions taken by the administration to shore up Silicon Valley Bank and others. Treasury issued a joint statement that stated, and I quote, "No losses will be borne by the taxpayer." Do you stand by that statement?
Yes.
And I just want to stress this is something that's deeply important to taxpayers, and I think it's something that I and I expect a lot of my colleagues, hopefully on both sides of the aisle, will be strictly holding this administration to account on. You, in the IRA, got an additional $80 billion, 6 times the annual budget of the IRS, through the, I should say, not directly Treasury, but the IRS, and 87,000 new employees. Now, the request in this year's budget, because that's what we're talking about here today, is for an additional 15% increase, somewhere on the order of $29 or $30 billion in additional. We still don't have the plan for the $80 billion in IRS funding, and there was supposed to be a plan made public several weeks ago. So could you speak to when we might see a plan, since there's a request now for additional funding above and beyond what was a massive, historic amount of funding in the IRA?
So the plan is almost complete, and you should have it in the near future.
And what does that mean, near future?
In a matter of weeks.
Okay. All right. I hope that you can follow through on that. And let me just ask, with respect to the use of that $80 billion, some of it I know was supposed to be funded toward taxpayer services, which I hope is the case, because the IRS has had a deplorable record on getting back to taxpayers, 13% phone call return rate. How much of that $80 billion is going to be directed to enforcement, and does the Treasury expect that any of that revenue is going to come from increased audits of middle-class taxpayers?
The President and I have committed that there will be no increase in audit rates on individuals or small businesses under $400,000, and I stand by that pledge, and I've issued a directive to IRS to that effect. And most of the hiring, the large numbers that are seen, are replacement of people who are retiring, but there will be additional hiring, both of customer service representatives. 5,000 more were hired this season, and the response rate has gone from the 13% you mentioned to around 85% this tax season, and we want to keep it at that level and add other things that will make filing and interacting with the IRS more convenient for both individuals and for businesses. But an important goal is greater enforcement, hiring of skilled tax lawyers and auditors and accountants to deal with high income and high net worth individuals, complex partnerships, and corporations where we think most of the tax gap is centered. And so, although $80 billion over 10 years, it sounds like a huge investment. It's one with an enormous payoff that it substantially lowers the budget deficit because we have a huge tax gap that needs to be addressed.
The time, my friends, expired. We're going to push very hard to get every finance member a chance to ask their questions before we go. Next will be Senator Lankford, Senator Cortez Masto. We've got the Secretary